regularly take a look at the data against what was planned, figure out what's happening, and actually figure out what the next step is, and then surface that up to ops, do something about it, surface that insight up to sales to reconsider, certain data points in the sales process, really making sure that we close the loop all the way and actually, make effective change with the data that we're seeing.
Welcome to the Agency Profit Podcast, a show dedicated to going deep space on agency operations, which is just as nerdy as it sounds. I'm your host, Marcel Petitpas. I'm the CEO of Parakeeto, a firm that helps digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. Join me as I interview some of the smartest thought leaders and agency owners in our space and go deep into operations, metrics, and all the other things you need to get right so you can spend less time worrying about operations and more time executing on your vision. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agency Profit Podcast. We are joined today again by the one and only Kristen Kelly. Hi, Kristen.
Hi, Marcel. Good to be here.
It is lovely to be hanging out and talking agency math, as we like to do.
As we do.
What's not to love? I'm excited about today's episode because this is like a nuanced thing that trips so many firms up. And it makes me sad. It makes me sad because there's a lot of well-intentioned people that are working really, really hard and they're doing the right things, but they're doing them in the wrong order and they end up getting stuck because it's like baking a cake. They put the liquids in before the solids and then the cake came out like a brick. And it's not always obvious that you should be doing things in an order that frankly is like kind of unintuitive. So I think that's what we're talking about today is how to think about sequencing both at the macro level and at the micro level when it comes to profitability. And this happens to be what we do with our clients because it's what we've learned from doing it hundreds of times for almost a decade. So I think that sort of frames up the episode. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say that so many of the clients that we see come through the door are just so puzzled because of the thing you're talking about. They have done a lot of work on the end of the process and they just can't figure out why the whole thing isn't working out, right? And it's because we've missed some early steps, and that's what we're here to talk about.
And it's particularly relevant because at the time that we're recording this, like you've just gone through an assessment with a client that like very much is in this situation, like really impressive level of sophistication, so much data, so many dashboards, so many spreadsheet formulas. Like this person is wildly competent at pulling data together. One of the most impressive business management metric systems we've ever seen. And yet they're still like not making progress on profitability, not really sure what to do, not really certain about the data. And it came down to a sequencing problem. Like they just way over indexed on the right thing at the wrong time and ended up spending God knows how. It has to be so many hours. I mean, this body of work is just like wild. So, this is why it's important. It's like that person, that agency could have avoided, I think, a lot of wasted time and gotten to the answer a lot quicker with a lot less effort if this was more clear. So that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they knew all their ingredients. They could account for them and exactly how much, but they didn't know they needed a tablespoon of baking soda instead of a teaspoon. You know what I mean? Like they didn't know how to benchmark that. So yeah, let's dig into that.
All right. So I think we start with macro sequencing. Is that right?
Yeah, let's do that.
So this is, I'll just sort of riff on this a little bit. I've talked about this on a lot of other podcasts. We've probably talked about it on this one, but we haven't done this like concisely directly in an episode. And so the first big idea is macro sequencing. And I'll preface this by saying like the goal of data is to provide insight that drives action, right? And this is like a thing we have to constantly be reminding ourselves. It's just like there is no value in a report. There's no value in a spreadsheet. There's no value in a dashboard. There's no value in a graph unless it creates an insight that drives the right behavior in the business to improve profitability. And so if insight is the goal, right, because insight is what's driving the action, then what is the formula for insight? And I'll use a little anecdote to describe why the formula is what it is. So let's imagine that we say, hey, the temperature is 76 degrees. Is that warm or is it cold? And of course, you can't answer that question without understanding like, well, are we in Nebraska in February or are we in South Florida in August? Are we talking about a bowl of soup Or are we talking about the I don't know, the environment in which a quantum computer needs to run, or like the environment in which an LLM chip needs to run? And so like 76 degrees as a data point is meaningless without a contrasting set of expectations. We can't interpret, right? Like, do we need to turn the temperature up? Do we need to turn the temperature down? Do we need to dress up? Do we need to dress down? Like, are we playing hockey or are we playing soccer? We can't make any decision without having the other side of that equation. Otherwise, it's just a data point and it's sort of meaningless in an untethered context. And it just so happens that most of the context that's needed to infer insight from that data point, in the case of a business, is simply having an understanding of what we expected. And the rest of the context of what we expected is sort of baked into the exercise of arriving at what we expected. So I share all of this to say the insight formula is expectations contrasted against reality. And probably the most common thing that we see is, in trying to get to the insight formula, if you had to choose between which one of those things to do first, people do the wrong one first. Now, I'm not going to say what it is yet, but I'm going to pause there. Maybe you can fill the audience in on what the right first choice is. But if you're listening to this and you're thinking, your answer is probably wrong. Most people get it wrong.
Yeah, I mean, we've got to start with a model of an agency, of the specific agency based on their composition, right? And it's because, what I often see is, agencies will say, well, I have a plan or I have a point of relativity, but it's just an industry benchmark that is just out there, just not really specific to their unique situation. And so it's really working together to start at the very beginning and develop that model or baseline plan of what we're planning to achieve, what we expect.
100%. Yeah. So to come back to the equation, right? Insight is a function of expectations versus reality. Most people start by going to the reality part. They're like, let's go get time tracking and go spend a bunch more money on accounting and bookkeeping and accruals and build this fancy dashboard and spend 6 months acquiring, integrating, training, compliance, managing people on time tracking data, only to end up in a boardroom where we're like, okay, our utilization was 54% last month. And then you have the temperature problem. It's like, well, is that good or is it bad? And what did we expect it to be? And why do we expect it? And should we be trying to get it to go up or should we be trying to get it to go down? And it's this realization of like, damn, we've been trying to wag the dog by the tail here by going to the hardest, most expensive, most time consuming part, which is measuring actuals. And then only to realize that like, well, actually this is not useful unless we have a contrasting metric. And then in that instance, to your point, they do another dangerous thing, which is they reach to industry benchmarks to understand if this is good or bad, right? So this is like, again, I'll keep using the temperature example because I actually think it's really good. Okay, well, the temperature is 76 degrees. And then it's like, well, is that hot or is it cold? It's like, well, the average temperature across the entire continent is 78 degrees. So you're like, oh, well, it's kind of cold in here. But it's like, well, no, actually, like you're in northern British Columbia in March. So it's actually quite hot because of your context. And so this is a dangerous thing about pointing to industry benchmarks. So to your point, we always want to start with insights first. I could talk a little bit more about why we do that. And our first exercise in doing that is we start with a model of the firm, which is not even a forecast. It's literally just like, if we just took all the ideas in your head about your people, how much they work, how much they get paid, how much vacation they get, what you charge for things, what your overhead costs, like, what does the business look like? What's going to happen if everything goes the way that you're planning for it to go? And does that make sense mathematically? That's step zero. It's like, what are we actually expecting from this business model? So we have a container to contrast actuals in.
Yeah, and I think that's where so much of the insight is unlocked when clients first come to us because they understand how much is going out the door from certain hard cost perspectives, but how does that all work together and what does that mean for what the agency is actually capable of achieving? That's the piece that they don't fully understand.
Yeah. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about why it makes so much sense to start with expectations. And there's two primary reasons for that. The first, there's three. The first is that it's really fast. And the second is that it doesn't require any net new information. And the third is that it's actually the prerequisite to properly installing feedback loops. Because the whole point of feedback loops, time tracking and finance data, is to give you an understanding of how you're performing against your expectations. And so it's like, until you've established your expectations in a structured way, how do you know what the structure of the feedback loop is supposed to look like? So just purely from an implementation sequencing perspective, it just makes sense to say, what are we trying to measure against before we install the measurement itself? But the other nuanced thing here is it's like, yeah, it doesn't take any net new information. So it's like all the information that you need to understand your expectations is already in your head. At the very least, it's probably scattered around in different tools and spreadsheets. And it doesn't take very much time to pull it together and to get clear on like, okay, what is this telling us mathematically? And the other thing that I think is important about this is there is no amount of feedback loops that are going to fix the problem of your planning to fail and you didn't know it. And like we've had a couple recent clients where that was exactly their situation. It's like, man, you have been working so hard to measure with absolute precision how perfectly you're executing on a plan that was setting you up for failure from the beginning. My God, you've been good at tracking how well you're adhering to this plan. And if we just fix the plan, then you'd be really good at adhering to that one too, and you would actually win. How cool would that be? But it's like we threw the baby out with the bathwater, and we missed the important thing, which is like we could have figured this out so much faster with so much less effort by just starting with, hey, does the plan make any sense? So that's why we start there. Like probably half, if not more, of profitability problems that we see with clients, we can understand just by looking at the plan and saying, oh, actually, you're just like planning to not achieve your goals. Let's work on that.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's a mix of frustration and relief when people realize that. I think when we go through this process, it's like, yes, it's simple. I wish I had done it sooner. But yeah, the relief because they know that they have the ability to apply said precision. But it's like, let's focus on the right area first. Yeah.
Now, I do want to have some grace for the people that are listening. Talking about like, you got to have a plan, you got to build a model of your firm. That's simple to say, but in practice, it's not easy to do necessarily, especially if you've never done it before. What are some of the things that you find like really have been holding people back from getting to that clarity on like, this is what our model is, and like, this is what we're expecting from our business?
Yeah, I think it's perhaps going in with just a set of expectations based on, again, kind of what they're seeing in the marketplace. It's like, oh, well, I see my client, other competitors charging this for this type of service, and that's what I do. So I need to be aligning my pricing to that rather than really kind of taking a step back again. Okay, um, how much does my unique team, cost to execute this work? How much margin do I need to earn on that work? And then, therefore, what price do I need to charge? It's, just really trying to look in the wrong places in terms of how to structure the way the business is run, rather than looking inward in terms of composition.
I agree with that. And I would argue that that also manifests in another way that is at least as impactful, which is the math. And it's this idea of like, you go out into the market and you're like, what's the formula for utilization? Right. And so you're like, oh, I'll take this definition of utilization from this firm over here, and then I'll take this definition of effective rate from this firm over here, and then I'll take this definition of project profitability, what even is that, from this firm over here, and then I'll take this definition of gross margin from this blog post that I read, and you put them all together. And of course, the math does not work at all, because these things need to be considered as an entire framework because they're all connected to one another. And of course, if you've never done the thought exercise, it took us years to figure this out, and it's literally all we did. And Ben and I would spend literally hours, like 4 hours at a time, just like mind numbing, like working through this math at a nuanced level. Very few people have the time or the desire to work through that math. And so if you've never done it before, like that is actually really hard to do. Because like, think about it, just utilization. Like, what is someone's capacity? If you're just like showing up to that conversation with no preconceived notion, it is like a very complex question. Is it all of their time? Is it does paid time off, holidays? What's included? What's not included? Is it client time? Is it not client time? What about, the office Christmas party that we have? And then what's a billable hour? Equally complex. And that's like just one metric. And then if you make a slight change to the definition of either of those things, it changes the entire framework, right? So it's like, that is really, really hard. I think it's what holds a lot of people back. And now that I've spent all this time, like, making you scared, know that like we have published our framework that we spent like the last decade essentially perfecting for free in the Agency Profit Toolkit. And we've also taken the tool that we use with our clients that they pay us lots of money for to build a model of your firm. And we've also made that free in the toolkit because it just feels like the right thing to do. So if you're listening to this and you're like, yeah, that is overwhelming. And I have tried to think about this, and I immediately was like, I need to stop doing this and go do something that's more stimulating. Worry not, because like we just made it free.
Yeah. I think what I hear a ton of, the line over and over that I hear is, I just don't know what I don't know. And so therefore they cobble together. And it's such a relief usually to come across just a holistic way of thinking that just works together. And that's what people want. And they don't often find it, they cobble, right? And so that's what we're here to basically help. Yeah.
So with all that being said, it is hard. So if you struggle with this, don't feel bad. Like it's actually super, super hard to think through all of this stuff if you've never done it before. But it is important. And that is the first place that I would start. Do the math, build a model of your firm. If you want to know how to do that, there's a free resource in the show notes that you can use to do so. And then we get into forecasting. That's kind of the second piece, right? So we know what we expect from the business. Then the next question, of course, is, are we planning to achieve that thing that we expect from the business? And so, like, what are some of the components of forecasting and some of the things that you find are important for people to remember when they go down this path?
Yeah, I think the first, I'll call it a stumbling block that people encounter when we're putting together a forecast is they often haven't really fully thought through how much effort or scope is involved in the work itself. And so we're finding it hard to build a forecast in the first place. And so that's again, why this sequence is important, because if we understand how much what are we modeled to be able to achieve with this team, and then how, okay, now what are we planning to do with this team, how much effort can we get out of them, how much work can we give them to fit within the available delivery capacity. So really it all is usually an exercise in going through a scoping and pricing process, where starting with scope, what is it that is going to go into this forecast here, clients, so we can see out ahead over a really long time horizon.
Yeah. Yeah, that is 100%. I think the major stumbling block there, and it's been enlightening how often we go into firms and we're like, yeah, tell us about how you price, and with a little bit of pressing and going around answers that are sort of straw men, we arrive at like, we're vibe pricing. Like, how do you know that you're charging enough? We don't really. How do you know that this is going to be profitable? We don't really. How do you even think about the profitability of a project when you're pricing it? Not really a good answer to that. And again, it's complicated if you've never done it before. Should you be thinking about net profit? Should you be thinking about gross profit? Like, how do you even define either of those things? How do you think about, if you are doing net profit, how do you think about how overhead and utilization factor into a project, which is like inherently super complicated, which is why I don't encourage people to think about net profit on projects, but I digress. It's hard, right? So don't feel bad if you struggle with it, but that becomes the next thing. And it ties back to framework again. But until you do that, until you're clear on how much money are we charging, how much of that is hours, how much time do we expect this thing to take, then you can't look into the future and understand the financial forecast of the business or the capacity forecast of the business. And those are kind of the two forward-looking ways that I think it's important for people to have visibility. There's one other component here that I think is important, which is the precision trap. This is one of the key places that people fall into a precision trap. Maybe share a little bit more about what that means and how you see that manifest for delivery organizations that are trying to forecast.
Yeah, so I think we see a lot of the tendency to get super precise comes from trying to gather this data from a project management or resourcing perspective and just get super granular about what's actually happening in the work. And, at that level, on a project management level, we do need to get pretty precise so that we can accurately distribute our resources on a day-to-day basis. But in terms of a top-down forecast over a very long time horizon, we just need directional accuracy. We need to know generally how much effort is tied to the work, and we need to represent that by role categories so that we can effectively determine, AGI and capacity across the horizon that we're looking out over. So the trap makes sense, and that really is just one of the talking points that we need to get through with our clients to make sure that we don't feel so much anxiety about nailing all those numbers at a very high level when we really just need some high level, we need top line numbers to be able to make executive level decisions.
Yeah, I think that's it's a good description of it, right? It's like, and ultimately, just to put that in like very simple terms, it's, I think a lot of people try to forecast by using a project management tool and assigning hundreds of tasks to dozens of people. So it's like you're trying to build a sandcastle out of like quicksand, essentially. Um, and the context matters, right? So like if a project manager is trying to figure out like what is my team working on for the next 2 weeks, that's probably the right way to do it. You need that level of precision. You need to understand on like a daily basis how much capacity does each person have. But when you're at the executive level, right, you have to think about, as you zoom out to, and there's two layers of abstraction that create this additional complexity. The first is broader time horizons. So if you try to go from 2 weeks to 2 months to 2 quarters of visibility, the amount of change and uncertainty increases dramatically. And then as you try to abstract to different levels of maturity in projects, which essentially means like you go further and further up the pipeline from stuff that's confirmed with a scope and a timeline that you know you're working on, to like stuff that hasn't closed yet, to like stuff that's still kind of being negotiated, you increase again the level of change and uncertainty. And the basic principle here is, for forecasts to be accurate, it or helpful, it needs to be accurate. It doesn't need to be precise. It needs to be accurate. And in order for it to be accurate, it needs to be up to date. And so if you're in a context where you're trying to look at a broad time horizon and you're trying to go up the funnel to immature work, what that inherently means is things are going to change all the time. In fact, probably the way you're having this conversation in the leadership meeting is, what if one of these 5 scenarios happens? And so the problem then becomes, if the way to look at a different scenario is, let's go update 500 tasks in a project management tool, there's just way too much friction. And so it behooves you in that scenario to radically simplify the data model so that it is more accurate in that context, because you're able to more quickly and fluidly make changes to reflect either what you think is going to happen or one of the different variants of what you think is going to happen, to, again, in your point, understand like roughly where things are going so that you can measure material deviation from the expectations in reality. And then as things mature and they get confirmed and the SOW is signed and it gets kicked off to delivery, then like let the project managers cook and do their thing in the project management tool. But the big mistake is like trying to make sure that those two things are inherently linked when ultimately they're serving like very different purposes. So that's a big idea, but I think an important one for us to talk about.
Do you want some free resources to help you measure and improve your profitability? If you do, then I want to tell you about our agency profitability toolkit, which you can grab absolutely free in the show notes or by heading to parakeeto.com/toolkit. It's packed with training videos, cheat sheets, templates, and all kinds of other great resources to help you start measuring and improving the essential metrics that are going to drive better profitability in your business. And it's helped thousands of other agencies around the world do the same. So I want to encourage you to go and grab a copy of that. And if you'd rather get in the fast lane and just have our team of experts guide you through the process of measuring and improving your profitability, then I want to encourage you to apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. And with that, I want to thank you again for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll let you get back to it.
Yeah. And I think the point of relativity that, is unlocked here, that is just an immediate win for our clients, is just knowing, okay, so here's what I'm planning. And then I can just go back to my model and see, how close am I getting to that? How close to like fulfilling this grand vision of my business am I getting with what I've got in flight? So that's insight number one right out the gate, without even bringing time tracking into the mix.
Right. And there's another big idea. I think I have this conversation all the time. People are like, yeah, we know we need to be measuring time. We know we need to be tracking time. We know we're not going to improve our profitability without tracking time. And they're surprised to hear me say like, well, you know what? That actually might not be that important for you right now. And I wouldn't be too worried about it. And there's a really good chance that we can get a very good idea of what's going on and make a lot of progress without you ever needing to install time tracking data. I think that's like not what people are expecting from us, but it's the reality, right? When you start with the right things at the right time, a forecast can go a long way. And I would argue it's probably, if I had to choose between having a feedback loop and having forecasts, I would choose forecasts every time. So that leads us to the third step, which is feedback loops, right? And so the value, of course, of the feedback loops is forecasts and models are made up of assumptions. And a lot of times our assumptions are not correct. we find out in the end that like, well, we thought that it takes us 200 hours to build this website product that we sell. Turns out it usually takes us 300. We thought that people could work 34 hours a week on clients and not get burnt out. Turns out that starts to happen closer to 28 hours. We thought this, that, and the other thing, that the timeline would look like this on projects. Turns out it often drags out to be longer than that. And those deviations from the assumptions are important because they stimulate two things. Number one, adjustments to the assumptions, if those things are sort of inherent and fundamental, and or conversations about how do we close that gap, right? Why does it take a lot longer than we thought? Is there something going on that we didn't know was going on? Is there a problem in our operations, right? That's where you actually get into the operational improvements that improve profitability over time. So that is sort of the last step, is saying, okay, we had a model that set us up for success. We had a plan that was setting us up for success, and yet we still missed. Why is that? And then we can get really precise about solving the right problem at the right time.
Yeah. And this gets into one of my favorite conversations to have with an agency when they've reached this stage, and that's installing that agency profitability flywheel, that self-tuning mechanism within the agency, where we are establishing a cadence with our team and the right players on the delivery and ops side to regularly take a look at the data against what was planned, figure out what's happening, and actually figure out what the next step is, and then surface that up to ops, do something about it, surface that insight up to sales to reconsider, certain data points in the sales process, really making sure that we close the loop all the way and actually, make effective change with the data that we're seeing.
100%. Now, the last thing to touch on, and we've touched on this already, but it's like, this is an important thing. A lot of the complexity in setting up these feedback loops, right? And we've seen unbelievable effort and artisanal implementations, right, of time tracking and project management tools that are so precise and so thoughtful, and that somebody puts so much of their time into maintaining, that ultimately when you export data from that tool and then try to match it up to the expectations, it's like two completely different languages, and you have to run it through a translation layer, and it's just a mess, right? And so that is such a key thing, is that if you've done a good job of starting with the model and the forecast, it should be crystal clear what needs to be true about the data coming out of this system, so that we can understand what was the actual result compared to our plan. And that's nuances like, what is a project? Like we spend a lot of time on that with new clients. So what is it? What is the definition of a project? Is it the phase? Is it the phase within the phase? Is it like the whole engagement, right? Like, what are the different objects? Do we have different services? Do we have different products, right? How do we group our projects into different segments? And then of course we have what we call role categories, right? So like, what are the important segments of time for us to pay attention to? Those kinds of things are all decisions that need to get made inside of a time tracking or a project management tool, right? How are we going to capture this metadata so that when we export something, we know how to match it up to our expectations the way that they're planned in our forecast? And so just know that, like, if you've ever run into that problem where you get a new tool and then you're like, tags, I wonder what our tags should be. Task lists, I wonder what the naming convention for our task list should be. And you're just kind of making all these decisions net new. That's probably a good sign that, like, you need to take a step back and go look at the forecast and say, well, what does that look like? And then how do I replicate that structure in the tool in a way that also like allows the team to work the way that they want to work?
Yeah. There are so many shiny things in project management systems today that can make the dashboards just like a thing to behold. But really, when you leverage all of them, it kind of takes you away from the overarching questions that you're trying to answer, right? Just to your point. So like, let's pull back, and what data points do we actually need to be able to answer these very specific questions? But yeah, the tools themselves have become a way to suck people in to tricking those things out for sure. And I love that you said artisanal. That made me laugh, because I feel like I did think of that adjective very recently, beholding one of our systems here that's come through.
Yeah, just true craftsmanship. But unfortunately, it's like, you've whittled this this beautiful, I don't know, this beautiful device that serves no purpose at the end of the day. Yeah. That leads us to the next piece, which is we talked about the macro sequencing, which is ultimately like, start with the plan, then look at the actuals. When you think about the plan, there's model and forecast, and then you install your feedback loops. Inevitably, what that's going to lead you to is an insight of like, okay, well, here's why we're not as profitable as we would like to be, or here is our opportunity to improve our profitability. And there's essentially 4 reasons that a firm might not be profitable. Their overhead could be too high. That rarely happens, but sometimes it does. More commonly, their delivery margin or their gross margin is not high enough. And there's essentially 3 levers for that. Their effective rate could be improved, their utilization could be improved, or their average cost per hour could be decreased. That's basically it. And so this is another place that I think people get tripped up, is they, again, do a ton of great work and do a lot of the right things, but they work on the wrong metric at the right time. So how do we think about sequencing those things? Like, all things being equal, barring some like nuances, which we can talk about, what do we tackle first, assuming that all 4 of those things are a challenge?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of this insight comes from our initial analysis and understanding of what's actually happening in the business. What we do is actually establish the model, like we talked about. We follow our sequence, so we understand what they're capable of achieving. In the first place, as a business, if everything went exactly according to plan, and then we can take a look at some data, usually over like a 12-month period, like what actually happened over the past year in your business, and it's really easy to surface of those levers that you're talking about, which one, where's the biggest delta between what you were modeled to achieve versus what's actually happening. And so that's where we can start to figure out, how do we start to place some focus on one of these things, moving forward.
Yeah, that's how we arrive, at like which of these things is more. And for most firms, it's like, it's pretty clear there's 1 or 2 metrics that are the opportunity. Every once in a while, though, we'll find like, okay, you're underperforming across like all of these. And in that scenario, there is a pretty clear framework, again, barring strange circumstances, to attack these things at, which is like, number 1, if it's overhead, that's usually the fastest thing for you to fix. And if you don't fix it, then it's like you could optimize your delivery margin, but you're still overspending. So that's a very quick thing to return to the bottom line. And it tends to be quick, low effort, and low cost. It's like you pull up your P&L, you figure out that there's like 40 seats on Figma that are still being paid for because like nobody went in and cleaned up all the people that transitioned out, or all the contractors that you kept adding seats for no reason. Like, you find all this kind of stuff. Or, you find things in the overhead bucket that are luxuries or sales and marketing initiatives that are not panning out, or the senior employee that like is awesome and you love them, but it's like, do we really need to have this many C-suite kind of titles or VP level titles at the organization? Like, let's be honest, right? This person actually ends up just being like an overpaid senior designer because they're back in the weeds anyway. So sometimes they're hard decisions. Sometimes they're easy decisions. But if you have an overhead problem, again, it very rarely happens, but that's the first place to look. Here's the nuance. A lot of people think they have an overhead problem, right, when they first look at this. But what they forget to factor in is, well, if we were performing at our model, would our overhead be appropriate for the size of their business, right? Because it almost always looks like an overhead problem at first, but it rarely actually is an overhead problem. That's a little nuance. So that's number 1. And then number 2, like, assuming it's not overhead, and it's usually not overhead, 95% of the time it's not overhead, it's delivery margin. Let's like, there's 3 levers there: average cost per hour, average billable rate, utilization. It pretty much always makes sense to work on utilization first. Because it can be quick, right? Generally speaking, the quickest way to solve for a utilization problem is to adjust the team to the appropriate size for the amount of business that's coming in. And assuming that your overhead is like reasonable, then like that should work out. That should return something to the bottom line very quickly. From there, it usually makes sense to attack average billable rate or effective rate second, assuming that that's an opportunity for you, which is a function of either charging more or spending less time to do the same work and getting more efficient there. And a lot of times, by working on average billable rate or effective rate, you're also going to start to improve your average cost per hour, because you're going to start like a lot of the same behaviors, a lot of the same questions are going to move those things. But that would be the last one, is average cost per hour of the team, which is ultimately about like having lower cost people do the work. There are some nuances to this, right? So like in some cases, average cost per hour is going to get moved up in the sequence if, for example, the firm uses a lot of fractional labor, freelancers, contractors, right? Because you can feel an exchange there very, very quickly. Where it's much slower is if it's a lot of employees. So then it's like, you might lower your average cost per hour on projects, but then you still need to like restructure the team for that change to take place, which could take months, or in some cases years, depending on the pace at which the organization is growing. So at a high level, that's the sequencing. Is like, if you have an overhead problem, doesn't happen often, but if you do, start there, then utilization, effective rate, and average cost per hour. That's it.
It makes it sound so simple, right?
Simple, but not easy.
Oh, I'm glad you also brought up the fractional, or not fractional, flexible labor issue too, because I do think that we're seeing so much more of that model present itself, in our client mix, and I think that's just a directional way that the industry's headed. And I think it is, or at least it feels that much more complicated to understand the model and pretty much how to work this whole thing, right, for that type of business. And yeah, it's definitely a solvable thing.
It is, yeah, but it does make things a lot more complicated. And that's like, I guess that's one of the things that's important to call out is things have changed a lot. You might sit around and think like, why isn't this solved? And I've definitely had that thought, like, agency has been around for a long time. Like, why isn't this solved? And the reality is, like, it was solved for a while when everybody just ran a time and materials shop. And like, it was like super duper solved for a while. And we had PSAs and we had the accounting department and everybody like knew how to run that business. And it was really straightforward. And then everything got complicated because we started using a lot more fractional labor. And then we combined that with all these, different pricing models that start to separate time and money and decouple them in like the very rudimentary way that they used to be coupled in a time and materials environment. And you started to see small firms have 3, 4, 5 different pricing models, 2, 3, 4 different like labor models. And now all of a sudden, like, this is actually a much more complex math problem. So that's part of the reason that I think it feels like everything's broken again. Plus you had the massive fragmentation of software where you went from like having these big all-in-one platforms that only big agencies could use to now having like literally thousands of options for all the varying pieces of a project lifecycle, from time tracking to resource planning to task management to invoicing to all the different aspects, scheduling and pipeline and so on and so forth. So yeah, things got complicated really fast, and that just is what it is. But that's I guess that's why we exist and why we spend time talking into a computer about this stuff, and people listen to it because it's like, it's still a problem.
Yeah. So how from your point of view, what does this unlock for businesses, having this whole sequence in place? How do things start to feel at an executive level once all these pieces are all working together?
Well, in a perfect world, it starts to feel like everyone is aligned. I think that's the feedback that we get most often, even just after doing the model, right? And in some cases, people come in knowing that they're not aligned and they're looking for that. In other cases, I don't think they realize how misaligned they were until they come out the end of the process, and they're like, "Wow, no wonder we've been struggling to improve this. Like, we spent all of our time arguing about what was going on and what the problem was and what we think we should do, instead of just working on the problem." And so when you take all the guesswork away from what the process is to find the problem, which we've hopefully discussed today, and then you get clear on the problem and you all get aligned on what the process is for solving the problem, which we also kind of talked about in the back half, then the team is just like in a far better position to actually like get some stuff done and work together and get all the friction out of the way and just like, all right, let's solve the problem. And most of the teams that we work with, like, when they're clear on what the problem is, they're very good at solving it.
100%. Yeah. There's clarity in that sequence. That's the thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And ideally, for those listening, like, this will change the way that you approach this problem and just get you to the answers quicker with far less pain. And, without necessarily having to like drag your team through 6 months of time tracking implementation, only to come out the other end without a whole lot more insight, which is just like a tragic story that we've seen many, many times before.
Many a time. Yes.
Yeah. Well, with that, Kristen, this was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. I hope that if you're still listening to this, you're either sleeping soundly or you've also enjoyed this conversation. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've ever found yourself thinking, man, I get so much value from this podcast, I wish there was something I could do to return the favor. Well, today's your lucky day because you can leave us a review wherever you're listening to this, and it is incredibly helpful. Of course, if you haven't grabbed a free copy of the Agency Profit Toolkit, go and get that. It's got tons of free resources to help you improve your profitability. If you're looking to get in the fast lane and get help from experts to improve your profitability and measure your most important metrics, then apply for a consultation at Parakeeto.com. We'd love to chat with you and figure out how we can help. With all of that, thank you so much for being a listener, and we will see you on the next episode.